In the last couple of years, people have started to warn us that if we carry on as we are with climate change and the damage we're doing to the environment, then sooner rather than later we're going to cause the collapse of our civilization. But no one ever explains what the end of civilization will be like. You know, when will it happen? In what order will things collapse? What will it be like to be in a civilization or a society that's collapsing? Is there anything I can do about it? So I'm going to make 2 videos. This one's going to be about 4 examples of the way the climate's changed, and they all sound like things that might cause damage to our civilization in the distant future. But as I think you'll see later on in the video, all 4 of them are already damaging our civilization, and the only thing that's going to happen is they're going to happen more often and they're going to be more severe when they do happen. So that's the first section. And then in the second video, I'm going to look at the nature of civilizations and put that together with the 4 different types of ways the climate has changed, and try and come up with an answer about what the end of civilization will be like. And I think it's more likely than not at the moment. If you're watching this and thinking, well, the idea that our civilization is going to collapse is a new and exciting prospect, for academics it's quite a well understood phenomenon, and in fact all civilizations throughout history have collapsed. Cambridge University has a whole department that studies risks to our civilization and to human existence. If you haven't got time to watch the whole video, I can sum it up quite well by a quote from one academic who studied the collapse of 28 different civilizations. And he came to the realization that great civilizations are not murdered, instead they take their own lives. Climate change. So first of all, I'm going to look at the 6 typical things that causes civilizations to collapse. And then when we're looking at these types of climate change, we'll see if it ticks any of those boxes. Number 1, resources. A loss of resource that a society needs. Number 2, insufficient responses to circumstances. Number 3, external intruders. Number 4, internal, such as class struggle or economic factors. Number 5, 2 or more events happening at the same time that make it difficult for the governments to respond. And number 6, random, insurmountable catastrophes such as pandemic or volcanic activity. And in fact, the last time the human race nearly became extinct, that was about 70,000 years ago. And that was caused by a volcano erupted. It put an awful lot of ash into the atmosphere. There were 6 years of winter. It disrupted the food supply and the human race was nearly wiped out. Anyway, the first example is a drought in Syria. In 2011, Syria suffered its worst drought for about 800 or 900 years. That led to 1.5 million people leaving the land and coming into the towns, and together with 1.5 million people who were refugees from the war in Iraq, it led to internal tensions, it led to peaceful protest. The government of Syria responded by shooting the peaceful protesters. It all degenerated into a civil war. Well, that's an example of where a country's already collapsed due to climate change. But it's also an example of where it didn't need to collapse. For example, Syria is quite a wealthy country, so it could have afforded to pay for food for people, even though they were affected by a drought. Syria was suffering because it already had internal tensions, because the government wanted to move the economy more towards the service sector, which mysteriously benefited all of the supporters of the Syrian government. It upset everyone else. So there's an example where Syria had 2 things it was tackling at the same time: the drought and internal tensions from its changes to the economy. Also, it's a good example to use because officially the people who died in the war in Syria would be put down as deaths due to conflict. But really, the underlying cause was the drought. Most famines aren't caused by droughts, but they're caused by conflict. And in a famine, the people who die, they don't starve to death, but they die from contagious diseases because the immune system is weakened. And the number 1 type of person who dies in a famine are children, because they're physically smaller, and also their bodies really need the nutrients because they're growing. So what might what really is caused by climate change, by the time it's gone through all the different levels, could go down to conflict or famine and all those sorts of things. And now, extreme heat waves. The climate is warming. The United Nations says that the people living in the tropics, which is the band of land that goes round by the equator, there's about 3,000 million of them living there, is going to become so hot it will be impossible to live there. It will be dangerous to go outside during the hottest part of the year. That's all going to happen sometime in the future, but long before then, extreme one-off heat waves are going to could quite easily kill tens or hundreds of thousands of people within a few hours. Scientists measure the stress on the human body through heat by what's called the wet bulb temperature, and that combines humidity and temperature to see how well a human body can cope with the temperature. Until recently, the highest wet bulb temperature ever recorded was 30 degrees Celsius. But I've got here an article from The Guardian, and I shall read that out if I can find it. A 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature was once thought impossible, but last year scientists reported that locations in the Persian Gulf and Pakistan's Indus River Valley had already reached this threshold, although only for an hour or two and over only a small area. Well, a 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature is significant because it's in the death zone. No matter how young and healthy you are, no matter how much water you drink or whether you stay in the shade, the human body can't cope with that high temperature, and you will die within a couple of hours. In hot areas, or in fact all areas, cities tend to be what's called a heat island, in that they're warmer. There's lots of human activity going on, burning fossil fuels and heating and air conditioning, all that stuff going on. It seems to me it's only a matter of time before an entire city is caught up in one of these extreme heat waves. You know, even if it only lasts for an hour or two, it could kill tens or hundreds of thousands of people in a few hours. No one would be able to get to save them because they would be caught up in the extreme heat. So there's the risk there that tens or hundreds of thousands of people could be killed. It's quite possible, if you live in the next city or in the next country and you see what's happened to your neighbours, you aren't going to wait around for it to happen to you. And like the drought in Syria only happened once every 800 or 900 years, it only has to happen once and it will have a really damaging effect. In the war in Syria, I think there were 4 million refugees internally within the country, and of those, just over 1 million came to Europe. The United Nations thinks by 2050 or 2040, there'll be something like 1,000 million climate refugees. Instead of 1 million people trying to get into Europe, it could be 250 million trying to get in, maybe another 250 million trying to get into the United States. And you might think, well, this is impossible, that's never going to happen. It's already happened. It's been recorded only for an hour or two, and in the Indus Valley and the Persian Gulf, it's already happening. And as the climate warms, it will happen more often and the temperatures will be some more severe. And in 2007, British soldiers serving in Iraq suffered one of these extreme heat waves, although I think theirs was partly due to the fact they were in Warrior armoured cars, which are big metal boxes without air conditioning. But this is what happened to them. On one operation in July, the battle group was out for 14 hours. The wind shifted, bringing warm air from the Gulf. The combination of heat and humidity meant the body's natural cooling mechanisms failed. Drinking water was no longer effective. Crews stood near naked in their vehicle turrets. Men collapsed vomiting and delirious. Radio communications were almost impossible as everyone was slurring so badly. At one point, the officer in charge wondered if they would have enough functioning crewmen to drive the vehicles back to the camp. Can you imagine 100,000 people like that in a city? I think it's now accepted that the world's ice sheets are melting. For example, the Greenland ice sheet is thought to have gone past the point of no return. By the time it's completely melted, it's so large it would have caused global sea levels to rise about 6 or 7 metres. That will be the end of London and all the major cities that are on the coastal areas. By the time the Antarctic has melted and all the other ice sheets, it's quite possible global sea levels have gone up 20 metres. There's no way of stopping that now. If you think global temperatures have risen by 1.1 or 1.2 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times, the best we can possibly hope for is a rise of 1.5 or 1.6. I think we're going for like 3. That seems to be the consensus at the moment, something in that range. But if all the ice sheets are melting now, they're really going to be melting in another 10 or 20 years' time as temperatures rise. It might take centuries or thousands of years for them to melt completely, but long before that I think civilization will have collapsed. And that's because of some research carried out by Sir David King when he was Tony Blair's chief government scientist, as about 20 years ago. He spent a year studying the effects of climate change of over 100 experts from all around the world, including people from China and India. China was involved because they wanted to know when they'd no longer be able to feed their people. And although the research was done 20 years ago, Sir David spoke at COP26, the big United Nations Conference on Climate Change in Glasgow last year. And this is what he said. The biggest risk is rising sea levels driving people away from their place of abode. The first city that will go under is Kolkata. It's already suffering from storms at sea, giving rise to floods. Bangladesh will become the first country to be unlivable, 160 million people looking for somewhere else to live. In 30 years' time, 95% of Vietnam will be under seawater once a year. Jakarta, capital of Indonesia, will not be livable within the next 5 to 10 years because of frequent flooding. You can still apply for a 25-year mortgage in Vietnam for about 12 billion Vietnamese dong, however much that is. Now, Vietnam is very lie-lowing. It's effectively the silt that's come up from the Mekong River. By the time you finish paying your mortgage, your house quite possibly will be underwater. And you might think, well, how are the financial people prepared to lend a 25-year mortgage in such a risky place? But you have to remember the subprime mortgage scandal. And there people were selling mortgages that they only had to get away from maybe 1 or 2 years to get their bonus. They didn't have any concerns about that. So 25 years in the financial world is a lifetime, isn't it? It's like in another planet. So anyway, right, here we are, China. This is the serious one. The biggest risk to China is failure of all rice production. 0.5 or 1 degree temperature rise from present level becomes a severe likelihood in any given year. We're talking about a period of when rice production in that part of the world collapses. Flooding of paddy fields in southeast China in 30 years' time. Once you've been flooded by seawater, that's the end of rice production, and that's because the seawater leaves behind the salt that poisons the land, and so you can't grow crops anymore. There will be no global economy as we know it today once rice production collapses like that. China will be on the global market for food. Markets will shut down. I can't help thinking Sir David's being a bit naive there. Have you noticed that China is growing its armed forces? In 30 years' time, if it's no longer able to feed its own people, I'm guessing it's going to acquire food from other parts of the world by any means necessary. In 30 years' time, China will run out of food, but it's happening already. The BBC have published an article about a village in Bangladesh which has been affected by rising sea levels. Seawater is gradually starting to creep into the land. It's poisoning their cattle and their trees, and also it's because the people eat the food that is produced on the land, they're becoming poisoned by the salt as well. The women are finding it difficult to carry children to full term. Now, they do get a very limited amount of help from the local doctor, who's giving them blood pressure tablets because all the salts give them the high blood pressure. But that's the only help they're getting, and I think you could describe that village as a simple society. So as life becomes more difficult to grow the food, as women are unable to produce children, the population will gradually decline, or maybe they'll move away. But gradually that society will sort of adapt to the amount of food they're able to produce. That's important to remember, because as we're about to find out now in Britain and farming, Britain at least claims to be a complex society. At least it is at the moment. What state it will be in by the time Boris Johnson leaves office, my mind boggles. But anyway, China's going to lose all of its food production by 2050. It's already affecting people in Bangladesh. You might think people in Europe and America will be safe, much more temperate, much more organised. But again, climate change is already affecting us. And in this next example, I'm going to look at how food production is being affected by extreme weather events. In 2020, the United Kingdom's wheat production collapsed by 40%, and that was caused by extreme weather events. To grow a field of wheat takes about 7 or 8 months. During that time you mustn't have any floods or droughts or extreme heat waves. If you've got Amazon Prime, you might have seen a series of films made by Jeremy Clarkson, the motoring journalist, and he tries to run a farm for the first time. He has a land agent, Charlie Ireland, to help him. He tries to run a farm for the first time. He's trying to sow his winter barley and he can't do it for 6 weeks because there's record floods. And Charlie Ireland, his land agent, says, if you miss the prime time for sowing crops, even by a few days, it can halve the yield. If you saw last year there were great heat waves in Canada, I think in one instant there were one town had 500 excess deaths. I think a town burnt down. But a much more significant damage on a global scale was all the wheat crops that were destroyed by the heat. In Europe last year there was flooding, people drowned in Germany. During those floods, lots of orchards and vegetable crops were destroyed. So at the moment, at our level of climate change, 1.1 or 1.2 degrees Celsius increase, we get random one-off extreme weather events that damage the food production. As climate change progresses, that will happen more often. The floods and extreme heat waves and droughts will become more severe. They become more difficult to produce food. Britain is more at risk than many countries because we're only able to produce 55% of all the food that we need. 45% is imported, and much of it from arid countries that are already water stressed. At any given moment, half the contents of the warehouse are 72 hours away from being inedible. In early December, and in a central aisle, 12,000 blood-red strawberries wait in the semi-darkness. They flew in from California yesterday. Strawberries journey from Israel in midwinter, from Morocco in February, from Spain in spring, from Holland in early summer, from England in August, from the groves of San Diego between September and Christmas. Britain is a complex society, and that means we can respond to these sorts of things. I'm guessing that no one in Britain except for farmers noticed that the wheat crop was down so badly in 2020, because we can buy in food from other places. We can, in the long term, we could grow different crops. Maybe the government could help farmers to grow crops better suited to the new climate. Maybe we could eat less meat. Maybe we could have a strategic food reserve. At the moment, Britain doesn't have one of those. It just relies on supermarkets getting it in, like strawberries, 72 hours away from being inedible. This all sounds fine. What that means is, unlike the village in Bangladesh, where the population, I'm guessing, is going to gradually decrease, our population is going to stay the same. Climate change is going to continue to make things more difficult, because we never do enough to tackle climate change. And the government will need to respond more to tackle increasing problems from climate change. With the same population, it will just become more difficult. And this is an example of something that all civilizations suffer from. All civilizations respond to problems by adding complexity. At the moment, the food supply in Britain is very efficient. The supermarkets are famous for shipping it in very cheaply. If suddenly the government has to start guiding people, if we can no longer get food from other parts of the world, if we have to grow different crops that might not be so productive, suddenly we're going to have to spend a lot more money and resources just to have food, which is fine because we know Britain's quite a wealthy country. We could afford to do that. At first, as climate carries on, it will get more difficult. The population will stay the same. And this is a problem all civilizations have, because all civilizations respond to problems by adding overheads, by adding complexity. And in fact, as all civilizations grow and develop, they become more complex. Governments need to provide more administration, needs more regulation, it adds more overhead. The academics believe all civilizations collapse because eventually this overhead overtakes any growth in productivity, and the whole thing falls apart and collapses. And it collapses because a key part of our civilization, or any civilization, is the relationship between the people and the government. The people expect the government to provide the things they need. So for example, during the COVID pandemic, we expected the government to tell us when to stay in, when to go out, what face masks to use, to provide enough hospital care, to sponsor the development of a vaccine. See, all of these things we expected the government to do. Added extra costs, you know, but that's what we expect. And it means with climate change that if we spend too much time responding to the effects rather than trying to stop it, we're on a road to nowhere. You know, there's no way we can possibly keep up, and in the end things are going to collapse. So those are the 4 types of extreme weather event that are happening already. They're going to get worse as the climate warms, and I think are going to cause the end of our civilization. And now I'm going to make a second video, and if you watch the next video, you'll find out for the first time why I'm stood outside. This is, by the way, this is Tilbury Docks, which is London's container port. I'm going to use it as an example of how complex and global and sophisticated our civilization is. So you have to watch the next video now, which will bear, if you're watching it on the day it's come out, probably in about a week's time. In between recording and editing this video, things have moved on a bit. In the video I said there could be 1,000 million climate refugees by 2050. The United Nations is now forecasting that there'll be 700 million refugees from the climate in Africa alone as soon as 2030. I warn that in the future it would be too hot to work outdoors during the hottest time of the year in the tropics. It's already happening. In India at the moment, it's dangerous to work outside after 10 o'clock in the morning because of a heat wave. I said that in the future there'd be a risk of tens or hundreds of thousands of people dying because of extreme heat waves as measured by wet bulb temperature. The Indra Star is reporting that billions of people are at risk from these very extreme wet bulb temperatures, many of them in the river valleys. If you thought this video was alarmist, I was understating the problem. The one rule of climate change is, no matter how bad you think it is always worse. A collapse in our civilization is coming, and it's coming sooner than we all think, including me. Thank you for watching. Any comments, let me know. But apart from that, we'll get the answer to what civilization's collapse will be like next time. So, goodbye.